Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel, and welcome back to another book to movie adaptation series that we're doing. If you're unfamiliar with these, we're doing this for Ready Player One. But we have previously done this for our It series when the It movie came out. So if you're unfamiliar with that, we'll link that series. But the concept for this Ready Player One series is we're going to have, I think, 3 or 4 videos. So we will have this video right here, which is our spoiler-free book review. So we're not discussing plot details or spoilers. And then after this video, we will have a reading vlog up where we do check-ins on camera as we're reading it and discuss our thoughts on specific plot details, so that will be spoiler filled. And then we will have either 1 or 2 movie reviews. That's going to be dependent on how we feel after seeing the movie. We will definitely have a spoiler-free movie review, and then we'll possibly have a spoiler-filled discussion about the movie, which will probably be an analysis of the book adaptation to the movie.
So let's go ahead and hop right in. If you've never heard of this novel before, it's pretty popular, so I'd be surprised if you haven't at all, especially with the movie coming out. But the concept is that it is set in the year 2044, and you follow this guy named Wade, and the whole world essentially exists in this virtual reality platform now. A giant video game, if you will, that's virtual reality. Everyone works in it. The currency runs through it. It's pretty much the only place everyone goes. The real world sucks. Everyone does that. And a race gets put into place when the creator of the Oasis is what it's called. He dies and essentially creates a contest for someone to inherit all his money and complete control of this global oasis that everyone is on. And things just get crazy from there.
So this book and the movie looks to be filled with references to 80s pop culture, which includes video games, movies, TV shows, etc. And that is due to the fact that the creator of the Oasis, James Halliday, grew up in the 80s, and so he is obsessed with it. And so he puts a lot of Easter eggs, and a lot of his challenges throughout the competition have to do with that time period. So I've seen a lot of people criticizing the trailers for the movie for being so nostalgia heavy, and I'm like, but that's the point. So essentially our main character becomes what is called a gunter, and that is someone who is hunting for this egg that Halliday put out into the Oasis they have to find. So everybody who's hunting for this egg also becomes obsessed with 80s culture, and it kind of has a resurgence of that pop culture essentially.
Yeah, all the TV shows come back in style, the fashion, everything like rolls back in. It's a very interesting concept.
As we said, this is going to be a spoiler-free review, so let's start with our main character.
Yeah, Wade Watts. He's a pretty interesting character. The book definitely doesn't portray him as the most likable guy.
Unfortunately, this this book relies heavily on nerd tropes, which are sometimes entertaining and sometimes a little cringy, and our main character falls into both those camps occasionally.
Yes. And so you follow him as he embarks on this contest, and throughout, there's moments where he's really likable and moments where he's not. I think a strong facet of the book is that it does not necessarily try to impact you one way or the other. It definitely presents Wade Watts as our protagonist, but the book doesn't necessarily tell you to like him or to not like him, and he definitely has moments for both.
Yeah, in fact, some of his less than desirable moments are called out by other characters in some circumstances, and to me that is a good way of displaying that this character can be flawed without it being praised, or the flaws being praised, essentially. Mm-hmm.
But overall, I think he's a compelling character that pulls us through the book, and while his overall arc can sometimes be cliched, I really enjoyed it.
We also have a plethora of supporting characters in this book, and I thought they were really individual and fleshed out pretty well. Like I said, sometimes characters fall into nerdy tropes, but for the most part, it was really enjoyable and entertaining.
One of the biggest strengths of this novel is the world building. The concept overall came before a lot of other, I think, VR concepts. I think it's a little more popular now, especially with VR becoming more of a thing. But the world in this is so fascinating, and he does a good job of putting little details of the virtual world that everyone's existing in, but also the real world and kind of politically how things are working and socially, both on the Oasis and out of it.
World building in all sci-fi books is very important, in my opinion, as someone who has consumed a lot of it. And I agree with Stephen that this pulls you wholeheartedly into the story, and I didn't have any trouble picturing what was being described. Like, there weren't a lot of holes, or the holes that were there were just enough for you to fill in gaps with your own, imagination, which is always a great thing for sci-fi books. With this being a book heavily drenched with 80s and 90s pop culture, I will say that a lot of it seemed very well researched. There's way too much in this book for me to go and confirm that. But the few details that I already had familiarity with were spot on. And I know Stephen had quite a few more than I did, as he is a little bit more entrenched in the video game world.
A little.
Would you agree that seemed pretty well researched?
No, I agree, and especially in terms of like classic games. Like I said, they were mentioning consoles that I have never heard of because they're so old and like pre-Commodore 64 era. There was tons of references and like anime references. I appreciated that this book didn't just go for like the mainstream easy ones, but it mentioned like 80s TV shows that you would have never really heard of unless you were like living in the 80s, and like weird animes, things like that ultimately were pretty cool to have every page chock full of. Another strength of this book is that it is a very easy read. Like, I felt myself blowing through it, and because of our reading vlog, we had to stop and take check-ins, and that was very hard to do because this book, everything flowed so well that while it's almost I think it's a 400-page book, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like you just blast right through it.
It's definitely something that you could find yourself just reading in one sitting unintentionally.
That being said, it is also a weakness of the book, too, because while it is so easy to read, sometimes the writing style leaves a little bit to be desired. Sometimes it's a little too easy to read, and it's not written well some of the time.
I will say this is something I noticed a lot more. This is the second time I have read through this book. I read through this book 3 years ago for the first time, and I actually did it on audiobook. And I think sometimes listening to something on audiobook, some of the strengths or weaknesses are not as glaringly obvious, especially when it comes to writing style, because you're not seeing it on a physical page. So for me, I didn't really pick up on that, and that might have had to do with the fact that it's a first time read and I was just thoroughly enjoying myself, and also the fact that it was on audiobook. Although the audiobook is read by Will Wheaton, and I highly recommend it.
It's a real easy read, but sometimes the writing style lacks some of the depth that it could have.
However, I do think that this was a ultimately good choice for the book, whether that was intentional or not, because of all of the references that may or may not go over a reader's head. I think that if it had been a little too more like a heavy or grand sci-fi, it might have been a little too dense for people with all of the references that are sprinkled throughout it. Making it an easy read made it a lot more accessible to people who may or may not have been familiar with this world.
That being said, as big sci-fi readers, we both talked about it. We're like, man, if this was like a 3-4 book, like epic, I would have totally been down with that.
With that, let's talk about another weakness of this book, which is the pacing, in my opinion. The first half of this book is paced extremely well, in my opinion. There are a couple of spots where it jumps a little awkwardly, but overall I felt like it flowed really well. And then the second half of the book just seems to go like full blast forward, and there were things I really wish had been spent more time on. And like Stephen said, this would have been really interesting as a drawn-out series. I think this very easily could have been a trilogy. Due to the fact that this is the author's debut novel, I'm not sure if maybe the publisher wasn't willing to do that, or maybe it wasn't pitched as a potential series. I'm not sure. But it definitely could have been way more interesting and fleshed out if it had been given a little bit more page time. I just found myself being pulled out of the book a little bit more due to these pacing issues in the second half. It wasn't quite as egregious as it might have been in another book, or a book that had this throughout the whole entirety of it, due to the fact that I was already immersed in the world due to the pacing of the first half, that I was dedicated, I was pulled in already. But there were times where I was just like kind of bored and wanted to put it down, not because of the subject matter, but because of the way it was being presented.
After we both finished reading it, we were also talking about the fact that seeing the entire novel from the perspective of Wade Watts sometimes also gets a little monotonous, especially towards the end, because he is not necessarily the most exciting of characters, and some of those side characters are very interesting, and it would have been cool to see some of their perspectives and not always just Wade's perspective throughout the entire novel.
Yeah, I will say, as a female who is part of nerd culture in at least some parts, I would have loved to see some perspective from the female character in this book who is also entrenched in the whole race for the egg. I think that would have been really interesting and provided a little bit of a break from the male perspective. Not that that was necessarily a negative, but I think it would have added some much more interesting perspectives of the book. With the pacing issues that came with the second half of this book, I did find the ending to be a little bit abrupt. Once the climax happened, it ended very shortly after that, and it felt a little unsatisfying to me. I don't remember that being something I thought about the first time I read this book, but a second time through, I was just like, wait, what?
I think a lot of the reason it feels abrupt is because there's some themes brought up through this book and some messages that it feels like the book is trying to convey. And towards the end, it seems like, especially in the final chapter, it just drops those, especially after heavily alluding to them in the couple of penultimate chapters. And then the last one ends and you're like, that's not where I thought it was going to go based on the things that were set up for it. And so on that, I wish they followed through with those themes a little more. I think it would have offered a more powerful ending, and if they had spent the time to flesh it out and go a slightly different direction, it would have been a little bit more in tune with what I expected based on the messages that you were getting the whole read.
Now, this book was originally published as a standalone novel. However, in the last couple of months, it has been announced that there will be a sequel, and this book has been out for several years at this point, so having read this not expecting a sequel, that dropping of themes and ideas was very disappointing, and the fact that there's going to be a sequel now, maybe we'll get some of those answered, but I still think it detracts from the original novel.
And to be fair, like we said, this is Ernest Cline's author debut. This is his first published novel, and so he does get some credit for that, I think, in that no one publishes a perfect novel on their first try. Some people never publish a perfect novel. And so with that in mind, I think it's pretty good.
Absolutely. I still think this is a completely enjoyable book. I think that I would say if you are familiar with any type of geeky or nerd culture, you would enjoy this. However, I have seen a lot of people who are in that culture who hate this book. This is a bit of a divisive one. I understand people's perspectives on it. I just don't quite agree with all of them, but that's fine. We all have different opinions. So it's hard for me to just blanket say this would be great for people who like this kind of stuff, because it's very evident that that is not always the case.
Which actually surprises me that this book is so divisive, because it doesn't necessarily feel like it says or does anything too controversial. I feel like in terms of its portrayal of nerd culture, it's pretty accurate, and it doesn't necessarily say things are good or bad. It kind of just puts it out there in this novel, and for that reason, I think some people treat it more divisively than it needed to be based on necessarily, I think, the author's intention when he wrote it.
Plus, there are things and choices that the characters make that aren't good and are things that are controversial and sometimes offensive, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the book itself is controversial or offensive, especially when those ideas and concepts are not praised, in my opinion.
Overall, though, I think we both really enjoyed this book, despite its imperfections. As long as you recognize that, I think you can go in and read a really fun, quick read of a novel that has a really cool idea, and you could probably actually finish it before the movie comes out here in a couple weeks from the recording of this video. Brittany originally gave it a perfect score on her Goodreads.
Yeah, I did give it a 5-star out of 5 stars the first time I read it, just out of pure enjoyment. But on a second read, I did realize some of the, like Steven said, less than perfect elements of it. And so that did drop it down to a 4-star for me. But for me personally, in my rating system, a 4-star is still highly recommendable.
And so for that reason, yeah, I think we both recommend reading this book. It's a lot of fun, and books don't have to be perfect to be enjoyable, just like movies.
That wraps up our first video in this Ready Player One series. If you are interested in seeing more from this series, please subscribe so you get notified of those videos. Like we said, we'll have a reading blog and some movie review videos coming out as well. If you did like this specific video, give us a thumbs up so we know that we should do more like this. And if you want to check out any other videos that we do a lot more videos besides book or movie related ones. We have TV shows, we have video games, soon to have some board games as well, hopefully soon. So if you're interested in checking out any of those, you can look at them right over there, and we will see you guys in our next video. Bye, guys.